BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this special weekend episode of Black Box Online Radio. Today we are revisiting the murder of Joan Webster and the serial killer Leonard Paradiso, and trying to both ask and answer the question, is there any connection, and of course determine the outcome. Leonard Paradiso is referred to as Boston's unknown serial killer, and he is accused of 7 different murders. The ones that we've been zoning into on these bonus weekend episodes relate to the 1979 murder of Marie Iannuzzi and the 1981 murder of Joan Webster. And you can see from the title here that we will be exploring the question as well, was the Zodiac Killer involved? Was Joan Webster a victim of Leonard Paradiso, Boston's unknown serial killer? Was she a victim of the Zodiac Killer, or is there an entirely different suspect out there? We're going to go through 3 major sections in this first part of the episode. The first will talk about Joan Webster and her disappearance from Logan Airport in 1981. The second will be talking about Gareth Penn and his book Time 17, and the third will be something that has been written by Eve Carson for this episode. She is the author of the book Mommy's a Mole, Whale of a Tale. I would first like to begin with an introduction that has been written about Joan Webster and something that could be connected to the Zodiac Killer called the Santa Claus card. And this is from ZodiacCiphers.com. Big thank you to Richard and everybody else who has shared Zodiac Ciphers, as well as promoting the show, people who leave comments over there. Lots of insightful statements. Joan Lucinda Webster, a 25-year-old Harvard graduate student, disappeared after her arrival at Boston's Logan Airport on the 28th of November, 1981, and her remains were identified nearly 9 years later on April 30th, 1990 in Hamilton, Massachusetts. The cause of death remains undetermined, and nobody has been charged with her presumed abduction and murder. The case is constantly kept alive by determined individuals keen for a resolution for this 39-year-old murder mystery, and is covered extensively on the Joan Webster murder site. Okay, that's a big nutshell version there, so let's go through this piece by piece. Joan Webster was traveling because of Thanksgiving break. She's a grad student at Harvard studying architecture. She's at Logan Airport in Boston, Massachusetts. She's in a taxi line. Then somebody approaches her and asks her to switch taxis or to get out of the taxi line. A man with glasses, with a beard, very disheveled appearance, a very rough-looking man, gets her to come out of the taxi line, even takes her suitcase, and then they move to a different vehicle. Joan Webster was never seen alive again, but people did notice that Joan seemed very familiar with this man. She didn't seem to think twice about it. She seemed to have been talking to him in a very comfortable and friendly way. And then they moved toward the car, and she wasn't seen again for nearly 9 years, 8.5 more like it. And her remains were found in a place near Tobacco Road. Yeah, Hamilton, Massachusetts is an acceptable answer, near the northeastern side of Boston. As far as this part here about they couldn't determine the cause of her death, she definitely had a large fracture to her skull, and almost certainly she was killed because of blunt force trauma. However, Joe from the Zodiac Killer Insight series, which is available here on YouTube, did point out that some other additional cause of death may have been involved, and people could not determine it because her remains had been so decomposed over the 8.5 years. Maybe she had superficial lacerations in some way. She had been stabbed or cut with a knife that simply was not found on her body because of the 8.5 years of decomposition. Joan Webster's body was also placed into trash bags, or into a single trash bag rather, and she was buried in the ground. Her clothes had been removed, and the jewelry that Joan had was still on her body, though. And when someone was out walking their dog, they found something in the woods that they didn't recognize, and they approached it, and then they realized that it was a human skull. The skull had actually been moved to a different location, and then later on, the entirety of her skeletal remains were discovered. Back to the article from Zodiac Ciphers. Joan's parents made a heartfelt appeal for any information pertaining to their missing daughter, which was broadcast throughout New England on Christmas Day in 1981, less than a month after her disappearance on January 18th, 1982. That sentence may have been a little bit jumbled. Christmas was less than a month after her disappearance. She disappeared on the 28th of November, 1981. But on January 18th, 1982, a $10,000 reward was offered by George Webster's employer, the International Telephone and Telegraph Incorporated service, for any pertinent information regarding the disappearance of Joan Webster, the young Harvard graduate. Gareth Penn, by some considered a Zodiac killer suspect, contacted George and Eleanor Webster suggesting that the missing woman may have been the work of the Zodiac killer. He was convinced that a Santa Claus greeting card was fashioned by the Bay Area murderer, and likening it to the November 29th, 1966 confession that was using Morse code and binary, along with a whole lot of mathematical trickery in a vain attempt to forge a link. However, he was able to receive copies of the Santa Claus card and envelope, to which he refers in a communication retrieved from the FBI files. Okay, so the Santa Claus card is something that I haven't talked about too frequently with the murder of Joan Webster. But is it possible that even if the Zodiac killer didn't murder Joan Webster, that he wrote the Santa Claus card and was trying to either take credit for a murder that he did not commit? And something that I did learn from Eve Carson, as well as reading up on the case, and she was the first person who shared it with me, but it's been covered in many of the news articles. Joan Webster's disappearance was not only broadcast on Christmas Day, it was heavily publicized by the Boston media, very, very well known in the New England area, and the tabloids latched onto the story, and it became very famous. What Richard has here on ZodiacCiphers.com is, the postmark does not give away its mailing date, but the family made a 1981 Christmas Day appeal, hence, Santa Claus card, followed up by the $10,000 reward that was posted on January 18th of 1982, making the deliberately chosen Santa Claus greeting card to be mailed in shortly after January 20th of 1982. That is because I have identified the newspaper cutting from this date. Those are Richard's words, reporting that the family offered a $10,000 reward for the missing co-ed. I can see no connection to the Riverside murder of Sherry Jo Bates on October 30th of 66, but if I was attempting to forge a link between the greeting card and the Zodiac killer, I would start by comparing it to the Christmas card mailed in 1974 to the sister of the missing nurse, Donna Lass. Okay, so is there any actual Zodiac killer connection here? The first point that I would like to make is, I often refer to the murder of Joan Webster as the Massachusetts connection in the Zodiac killer case. There's a very strong Montana connection that we've been talking about in a couple of the recent episodes, but this Massachusetts connection is something that is quite different. And Gareth Penn was almost trying to set himself apart from the crowd. In the later parts of Time 17, he talks a lot about not only the murder of Joan Webster, but the murder of Marie Iannuzzi from 1979, because the authorities, especially the prosecutor/assistant district attorney Tim Burke, believed that Leonard Paradiso, the serial killer, was responsible for the murder of Joan Webster as well as the murder of Marie Iannuzzi from 1979. One of the few points where Tim Burke and Eve Carson actually agree is that the Zodiac killer did not commit the murder of Joan Webster. They just differ on who actually did it. Tim Burke says Leonard Paradiso, and Eve Carson more or less says that there was a police cover-up. If we can go over to the, I guess you say the third section of Time 17 that has been made available online. I have a book discussion about it here on this channel if anybody would like to hear some more detailed responses to Time 17 by Gareth Penn. I'm actually holding the copy, though, that was sent to me by Ray Grant, so much appreciated, definitely. Thank you for that. But about the murder of Joan Webster and the murder of Maria Iannuzzi, Gareth Penn is going to share some things for us following the trial of Leonard Paradiso in the murder of Maria Iannuzzi. And what he has here is that someone had called him at home on July 5th of 1984 and asked for Diane, then hung up when Diane came to the phone. I imagine that she had found, by using the Haynes crisscross directory, that the phone number which Mike O'Hare had given was listed under the name Diane. She had just called to make sure that there was somebody named Diane living with me. I suspect that she did some other research too. It was about a week later that I started getting one ring, hang-up phone calls at work as well. When they began coming, I asked the receptionist to keep a record. Using an electronic digital clock at the reception desk, on the 10th of August, 1984, we got a call at work at 12:38 p.m. There was another at home at 9:22 p.m. on the same day. These two calls replicated the firearm calibers used by the Zodiac. First, being clear, the .38 caliber, and then there was the 9mm, and then the .22 caliber, 9:22 p.m. That has 2 and 1. These two calls replicated all of the firearm calibers used by the Zodiac. On the 11th, there was a nocturnal call at 12:20 a.m. After that, there was nothing for almost 2 weeks. At the same time, a new pattern began to emerge. Here's why I have somewhat of a problem with Gareth Penn and his theories and sharing anything that's going on in Time 17. What did that last sentence just say? Oh yeah, a new pattern emerged. Somebody called him at 9:22, somebody called him at 12:38, and he's trying to think that that is evidence? That's just talking in circles, more or less. And also, I really don't want to bring up that whole number 23 phenomenon stuff again, but you can play these number games any way you want with the appropriate amount of cleverness. What if somebody sent him something in the mail that had the number 38 written on it, and he's like, oh, look, it's a clue. Not only is it a zoning code for Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's also a .38 caliber. But, I don't even want to get into the gun calibers things because Gareth Penn would go on to revise this stuff later on in his book, The Second Power. But about this here, I'm not the biggest fan of this thinking. And you can hear the book discussion that I do have on Time 17. I have book discussions on various Zodiac Killer books, Zodiac Unmasked by Robert Graysmith, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer by Thomas Henry Horan, as well as The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart. The book discussion on Gareth Penn's Time 17 is the shortest, and the reason why is because of these things here, these mathematical signatures that he claims to have been receiving. And you have to accept the premise that everything in the Zodiac Killer mystery is a mathematical signature, even down to the times when Gareth Penn is getting these phone calls and, following along with a digital clock. Oh, this person is trying to communicate to me with numbers. I didn't accept that. I didn't accept the initial premise that everything is a mathematical signature or that anybody is trying to communicate to him with numbers. So that's why that book discussion was only 6 episodes, but there is a playlist about that here on this channel. What I'm more fascinated with in this chapter here is his assessment of how he begins to disagree with the prosecutor's narrative involving Leonard Paradiso in the murder of Joan Webster, as well as the murder of Maria Iannuzzi. And he also seems to track somebody down who was an ex-girlfriend of Leonard Paradiso. And she says that my ex-boyfriend got convicted for the murder of Joan Webster. Bear in mind that Joan Webster's murder was much more heavily publicized in the tabloids, and Gareth Penn, of all people, wants to point out, Well, this is what the media does. This is how the media is altering people's thinking. Leonard Paradiso was not convicted of the murder of Joan Webster. He was convicted of the murder of Marie Iannuzzi. Then the prosecution attributed Joan Webster's murder to him. So, I said that Tim Burke and Eve Carson have one point that they are in agreement with, that it wasn't the Zodiac killer. Well, Gareth Penn and Eve Carson would be in agreement that it wasn't Paradiso who committed that murder, and that the authorities wanted Leonard Paradiso convicted of the murder of Marie Iannuzzi, so that then they could put Paradiso in jail, that they could then later on attribute the murder of Joan Webster to him, and then they could close this high-profile case. Now, there's also something in here in Time 17 that talks about how the state wanted Paradiso to confess. They wanted to put him in jail, give him life in prison for the murder of Marie Iannuzzi, and the deal that he would get is that he would get certain privileges in prison, and he would be able to serve out the remainder of his sentence in any prison that he would choose, like the lowest minimum security prison. He could get a private cell if he wanted, and so on, in exchange for confessing to the murder of Joan Webster. Now, in Time 17, there are lots of things that he talks about from a prosecutor named Tim Burke, whom I've previously mentioned. And he says that Tim Burke relies heavily on two jailhouse informants who have come forward and say that Leonard Paradiso bragged in prison to killing both Joan Webster and Marie Iannuzzi. Tim Burke maintains that position to this day. He even told me, in his own words a couple weeks ago, that there is no doubt in his mind that Leonard Paradiso murdered Marie Iannuzzi and Joan Webster because he bragged about it in prison to two different people. I mean, 40 years later, he's standing by that claim. The other thing that I began to notice about the murder of Marie Iannuzzi, which I have to confess to you, is a little bit not exactly easier to unravel, but I can't think of a better way to describe it, because Marie Iannuzzi had a definitive connection to Leonard Paradiso, and I have a whole presentation on how her murder was conducted, but Gareth Penn really gets a lot of it down in a pretty solid way, talking about how Leonard Paradiso and Marie Iannuzzi knew each other. I would like to go to page 195 of Time 17 by Gareth Penn here. Marie Iannuzzi had been a voluptuously built young woman in her early 20s. She lived with a boyfriend, David Doyle, but she was often unfaithful to him. They fought constantly about infidelity. On at least one occasion, Doyle had attacked her, putting his hands around her throat as if to strangle her. When they fought, she often scratched his face. Their neighbors were familiar with their battles. As far as leaving marks on her, there was at least one incident prior to Marie's murder where David Doyle had grabbed her around the neck and strangled her enough to leave red marks along her neck. I haven't exactly heard that she frequently left scratches on his face before, but Marie Iannuzzi did have long fingernails. On the evening of her death, Marie and David had been at a wedding reception together with Leonard Paradiso and his girlfriend. Marie was very drunk and made passes at all of the men. David flew into rage. They fought, and they made quite a scene. He stormed out of the party by himself. The host asked Paradiso and his girlfriend to take Marie home. She was too inebriated to make it by herself. She was wearing a black leotard, black tights, and a red wraparound skirt and a scarf. About this here, I think the thing that actually set David Doyle off is that he is at the wedding of his cousin, mind you. This is the reason why Marie is there. They were attending the wedding of David Doyle's cousin, and David Doyle ripped his pants at the wedding. That's actually what he is mad about, not something immediately tied to Marie. As far as storming out of the party, he went home because he ripped his pants, and they asked Paradiso and his girlfriend to take Marie home, but they ended up taking her to a bar that was 2 blocks away from her home. It was called the Cardinales Nest Bar in Revere, Massachusetts. This is the interesting part. Paradiso dropped her off at a bar near her apartment, which she shared with Doyle. She said he recalled that she was afraid to go home to confront David Doyle. Sometime later, Paradiso came back to the bar and left with Marie, or perhaps it was Paradiso's girlfriend, or perhaps Paradiso and his girlfriend. The testimony of people, it gets very mixed up at the bar on this point. Now, I would like to just try and clarify a few of these things. When I did the presentation on the murder of Maria Iannuzzi, it followed this narrative. It's not Paradiso who drives Marie to the bar on the night that she's murdered. They're at the wedding, right? Then there's this party that happens after the wedding where they say that Marie is being very loud. She's supposed to be taken home. It's not Leonard Paradiso that takes her to the Cardinale's Nest bar. It's Paradiso's girlfriend, whose name is Candy Wyant. She drives Marie to the bar, which is 2 blocks from her home. Then they learn that some of Marie Iannuzzi's belongings are left in Candy Wyant's car. Then Candy Wyant drives back to the party. She sees the missing items, so Leonard Paradiso and Candy Wyant drive to the Cardinale's Nest bar to give Marie Iannuzzi her items back, and then Marie is seen exiting the bar while Leonard Paradiso is holding the door open for her. This is when the prosecution's timeline stops, and they say, okay, it was Paradiso by himself. He abducted Marie Iannuzzi, and then he drove her to a different place and, murdered her. But then what actually happened is, according to Eve Carson's timeline, Maria Iannuzzi re-entered the bar around 1:45 a.m., and she was seen by 4 different eyewitnesses. What Eve Carson tries to point out is that her theory is that Leonard Paradiso was driven home by Candy Wyant, and they didn't even stay in the same place together that night. Candy Wyant then goes from Paradiso's home to her place, so Leonard Paradiso didn't even have the car. It was in the possession of Candy Wyant. But I'd like to go back to Gareth Penn's book here. In any case, her body was found the next day out in the marsh near the clam digger's shop where Paradiso peddled bait. She had been strangled with her own scarf, and her shoes and tights were missing. The medical examiner found semen in her vagina. Ordinarily, if there had been any reason to suspect rape, the semen would have been examined to determine the donor's blood type, but in this case, there were none of the scratches, cuts, or bruises that were usually suggesting a rape had taken place. Rape was the farthest thing from the medical examiner's mind when examining her body, and no semen test was made. To add some clarity to this as well, they believe that Maria Iannuzzi had consensual sex within 24 hours prior to her murder. But they did not do an examination to determine whether or not she had been raped. Gareth Penn actually had some very strong analysis on the possibility of Leonard Paradiso committing the rape of Maria Iannuzzi, and I would like to jump ahead to something that he has written here on page 196. Many women wear tights over their leotards, others wear them under. If Maria Iannuzzi was one that had the latter of sorts, then in order for her to have had sexual relations with anyone, she would have had to have taken off her leotard first, then her tights, in order for her to be wearing only the leotard in the case that she was found, or in the way that she was found. Her murderer would have to take off the leotard, remove her tights, rape her, kill her, then put her back into the leotard. If she was wearing tights over the leotard, he could have pulled them off, but then he would have had to have contend with the crotch of the leotard, which didn't have any snap closure. Besides that, there was just no evidence of rape whatsoever, only that she had sexual relations with a man of an unknown identity. And I've asked Steve Carson about this, and I believe she said during the trial, they said that Leonard Paradiso would have pulled off the tights by pulling them across the groinal area of the leotard, for lack of a better term, even though there are no snaps or openings. And I think that is pretty far out. Okay, though, the thing that I found much more, I did think that was a very good point that he brought up about how if they're going to establish this narrative that Leonard Paradiso is trying to rape Maria Iannuzzi, then it's just going to fall flat because it seems like it didn't happen. Well, if that didn't take place, if Leonard Paradiso or David Doyle or Michael O'Hare or anybody was trying to kill Maria Iannuzzi, well, what on earth happened? Well, let's just keep going. The prosecution scenario went like this. Paradiso took Maria Iannuzzi away from the bar to a secluded location where he forced his intentions on her. She resisted, so he wrapped the scarf around her throat, strangled her, and in a state of unconsciousness, then raped her. After he had finished raping her, he strangled her some more so that she was dead, and nobody saw him do this, and he did not confess to it. There was no physical evidence to support it. It was only that a rape charge could be made to stick given the lack of evidence. Or it really says it was the only way. I think this provides a certain level of clarity to the situation, because Maria Iannuzzi's scarf was tied in a double knot, and I asked Eve Carson very clearly, well, is this just something fashionable that Marie was wearing? Did she tie the double knot herself and then someone just slid it up a little bit tighter, or they grabbed a hold of the scarf so that they could, once again, tighten it around her neck? But I believe Eve Carson has said that Marie did not tie the double knot. She had her scarf, of course, but I think that this could provide something that someone strangled her first to be unconscious, and then later on tied the double knot and forced it down to strangle her to the point where she would pass away for a variety of reasons. But, I mean, if Leonard Paradiso didn't have the car, that would completely exonerate him. And I should be clear that Michael O'Hare or Gareth Penn or anyone connected to the Zodiac Killer mystery is not actually a suspect in the murder of Marie Iannuzzi. They're suspects in the murder of Joan Webster. But first, to get to the murder of Joan Webster, we have to look at the events of August 12, 1979, which it relates to what we were saying here about Marie Iannuzzi. Then to the murder of Joan Webster. I thought that Gareth Penn's assessment of this was a little bit shaky, to be honest, because he says Joan Webster is in the taxi line at Boston Logan Airport, and then she is approached by this person whom she seems very comfortable with, although if a serial killer is probably the only person that can put people in a strong sense of ease, but she seemed to have great familiarity with her abductor, the person who lured her away. She was murdered on or about the 28th of November. We don't necessarily know for sure, but I thought that Gareth Penn may have been a little bit shaky with his analysis when he says, why would this 25-year-old Harvard architecture student have accepted a ride from Leonard Paradiso, an 8th grade dropout who sold clams for a living, and first he's going from the airport, driving an illegal taxi. He gets her onto his boat, the Malafemina, offers her a drink, and then maybe they did something but in between, but he tries to sexually assault her. Maybe he successfully sexually assaults her. Then he beats her to death with a whiskey bottle. That's what Gareth Penn is even just beginning to talk about, and I don't think that was quite the prosecution's timeline from looking into this for the other episodes. I think that the way that they have described it is, Leonard Paradiso was driving an illegal taxi. He approaches Joan Webster at the airport, and he asks her, do you want to come into the taxi? It's a cheaper price, and so on. They said that, well, I'll just keep going with that. He then drives her to his boat, and then pulls a gun on her, and she entered the boat under the threat of being shot. He had her at gunpoint. She didn't voluntarily enter the boat to go on some type of midnight cruise, the way that Gareth Penn described it. And then while she's being threatened with at gunpoint, he sexually assaulted her. Some altercation occurred, and he struck her with a whiskey bottle. I had always thought that Joan Webster had actually been murdered with the whiskey bottle, and this is another thing that I asked Eve Carson about when I was like, what was she actually killed with? What was the blunt force trauma that was involved with attacking Joan Webster? Because she did almost certainly die from blunt force trauma based on the impact in her skull. And Eve Carson said it most likely was not a whiskey bottle. That was the prosecution creating some distortion. She was most likely struck with either a bat or a tire iron that could have actually generated that level of force. And as far as finding the gun, I think that is a very long explanation, but that just is quite shocking to me, that he's going to lure her onto the boat at gunpoint, then decide to use blunt force trauma, maybe strangulation. And they talk about this a lot, that He strangled her and hit her with a whiskey bottle. Well, what does he have the gun for? And I say that because the prosecution then said he threw the gun in the water. Why is he getting rid of the gun? If he didn't use it, he would have no reason to hide it. But that's just my 2 cents. I don't think that theory makes sense. And the boat theory has been mostly debunked because the boat that they're talking about, the Malafemina, didn't exist at the time. It was underwater. Or, I mean, like, it wasn't a registered boat or anything. It had been submerged because of the, well, Leonard Paradiso sank it because of an intentional insurance fraud. And I would like to go on to the next point here because I said that I would get to Eve Carson's comments on the Zodiac Killer. I wanted to know very clearly, why is the Zodiac Killer separate from the murder of Joan Webster? I've talked about all of my reasons, saying that she was killed with blunt force trauma. The Zodiac Killer didn't do that. She was abducted. The Zodiac Killer didn't do that. I also don't think the Zodiac abducted Kathleen Johns on March 22nd, 1970. And the Zodiac Killer didn't bury the bodies of the victims. Other than moving Paul Stein's body in the taxi, the Zodiac did very little to touch the bodies of the victims. I mean, of course, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, but both of them did survive. They weren't dead yet. And the Zodiac certainly didn't strip the victims naked, leaving their jewelry on, though, and tie them up in a trash bag and bury them in the ground. And the Zodiac also didn't operate in Massachusetts. Okay, but those are my answers. This is Eve Carson's, what she has written for me here. There are several things that ruled out the Zodiac theories. First, Gareth Penn's manifesto was dismissed by the FBI. They found his conclusions forced and unreliable. There really was no evidence that put Joan's case into the Zodiac's wheelhouse, other than Gareth Penn's contentions. The most convincing piece of evidence was that the eyewitness description was from the town taxi cabbie. Joan knew and trusted the man at Logan Airport. She would not have changed cars otherwise, even if it was someone she casually knew or recognized. And I should insert that Gareth Penn does say that in that section of the book that I was just reading. Joan Webster was an architecture student. Michael O'Hare had architecture connections to that department at Harvard, or he had connections to the architecture department at Harvard, where Joan was a student. So that's how he claims that he would have been able to get her in the car. Eve Carson disagrees. The car was there, ready and waiting. That indicates premeditation. We know what happened to her. She got into the car. She disappeared and was found murdered 8.5 years later. None of the theories of Zodiac suspects places the suspect in the time and place to commit the crime. Joan didn't know any of them. They wouldn't know her changed travel plans. Authorities ruled out Michael O'Hare. Even if Joan recognized him, she wouldn't have changed cars with him. Joan knew the man at the airport, no question. The fact that Tim Burke, the prosecutor, the trooper Andrew Palumbo, and the detective Carmen Tamaro, and Joan's father George Webster pressed so aggressively to pin this murder on Leonard Paradiso is a determining factor. You have to ask, who did they cover up for in an effort that began in December of 1981. Thank you to Eve Carson for all of these here. As for the first part of this, Gareth Penn's manifesto was dismissed by the FBI. They found his conclusions to be forced. Oh, that's exactly what I was saying about that whole, someone is calling me once and the phone is ringing one time. They're calling once at 12:38, once at 9:22. Yeah, I have a 6-part book discussion on Time 17. That one sentence encapsulate all of it. I think Gareth Penn's conclusions are forced. He doesn't provide certainty on how these mathematical signatures and these numerical communications, like someone calling and the phone rings once, like that is significant. I just don't feel convinced. I don't believe that he has done enough to show that this is actually the Zodiac Killer communicating with him, as well as everything about the Morse code and the binary. It's very forced. Oh, fascinating. Do not misunderstand me. Fascinating. This type of Massachusetts connection to the Zodiac Killer mystery, it would make for a great novel. Just the way that somebody would operate. And I can't get rid of that thinking. With the Bates murder in 1966, someone lures somebody away from the car. At Lake Herman Road, someone's shooting bullets at the car. At Blue Rock Springs, someone approaches the car window At Lake Berryessa, somebody is writing a message on the car door. At the Stein murder, someone is riding in the taxi cab. Now with the murder of Joan Webster, somebody is driving the taxi cab. It's like there's some type of mechanical mechanism going on in the Zodiac killer thought process, but that's just interlocking creativity. So thank you to Richard Grinnell, Eve Carson, Gareth Penn, and everybody else who has written material cited in this here, including Tim Burke, who's the author of the Paradiso Files. What do you think happened to Maria Iannuzzi and Joan Webster? You can think about that during the break, and then we will look at a PowerPoint presentation that Eve Carson has created, which will go through some of the evidence in Joan Webster's murder. Be right back after this.
You are listening to Black Box Online Radio.
This show is brought to you by TeeSpring. Feel free to check out the merchandise. Almost all sizes and colors are listed.
Black Box Online Radio. And remember YouTube Premium. You can download the show, take it on the go, anywhere and anyhow.
Please like and subscribe. Grazie mille.
Okay, hello, and we are back. In this segment, I would like to go to the presentation that was created by Eve Carson for this show, where we will look at how Eve challenges both the Zodiac killer angle as well as the one that was established by the authorities, their claim that Leonard Paradiso had murdered Joan Webster as a sole perpetrator. So first I would like to go to the first slide, where she starts out by saying that the Paradiso Files by Tim Burke alleged evidence in the Joan Webster case, and this will set the scene that Joan Webster was murdered on Leonard Paradiso's boat, the Malafemina, which means evil woman in Italian. That's the alleged crime scene. Then the alleged murder weapon was a whiskey bottle, and there is a very important piece of evidence that we haven't talked about yet in these presentations, and that is that there's going to be a book that was actually photographed on the shelf of the boat, the Malafemina, and the authorities were trying to say that this was a textbook that was owned by Joan Webster that ended up in the possession of Leonard Paradiso. That would be some pretty damning evidence, at least to say that she was present on the boat, if that book did make it there, but we will hear Eve's challenge to that. We'll look at the red silk jewelry pouch, which they claimed also was from Joan, the charm bracelet, glass shards on the boat, a splinter in the finger of Leonard Paradiso, the fake 357, and the alleged Paradiso confession to Robert Bond. And it says that this is a break in the case. The prosecutor, who is seen in the picture here, named Tim Burke, will use that as his strongest piece of evidence. And, I mean, his narrative has not changed from Gareth Penn's publishing Time 17 to sharing the information with me only a couple weeks ago, that this is the biggest piece of evidence that he has, the jailhouse confession from Leonard Paradiso to Robert Bond, which is just Bond acting as an informant. It definitely wasn't a confession from Paradiso. Leonard Paradiso maintained his innocence throughout the entirety of the trial, as well as until his death in 2008. Tim Burke's alleged crime scene, the Malafemina, he says that he says that the crime occurred on the 28th of November, 1981, but Paradiso sank his boat on July 26th of 1981, and it was, there was even a bankruptcy case about that, and the whole point is, by August of 1981, both of the assets were long gone. There was no crime scene. I mean, if they're going to talk about trying to pin some murder on a guy and saying that he murdered Joan Webster on the boat, they should probably choose a boat that was actually either on dry dock or on water at the time, not under the water. The long story short is Paradiso intentionally broke the rudder so that the boat would sink, and then he could claim the insurance money. It was an insurance fraud attempt, but it almost certainly, the boat theory, it was not true. The alleged murder weapon was a whiskey bottle, and the reason that this gets pulled into it, I asked Eve Carson about this directly, was Joan Webster actually murdered with a whiskey bottle, and she said no, she was most likely struck with a bat or something like a tire iron, possibly. If you look at this slide, you can see that there's a photo of liquor bottles on the boat, the Malafemina, the interior photo with liquor bottles on the shelf. And notice the low headroom. This is what Robert Bond talked about on January 14th, 1983. Bond sees the photos tacked on Paradiso's cell wall, and then he gets the idea that this is going to be the murder weapon. What Bond actually said was that they could choose between strangulation or being struck with a whiskey bottle, and he was not completely sold either way. And Robert Bond's testimony overall is very wobbly. He's talking in a very vague way, and it's quite difficult for us as just listeners who are learning about this stuff 40 years later to interpret his info, especially that something that Eve Carson wanted to reiterate. Robert Bond was not the most intellectual individual, and, I mean, by her own admission, after interviewing Robert Bond, as well as having her private investigator interview Bond, they determined that he really had very low-functioning critical faculties. Now, moving on to the next slide. Andrew Palumbo, items seized during the Iannuzzi search. The Iannuzzi search warrant on April 25, 1983, recovered no items related to the Iannuzzi murder. And, more importantly, there is no connection between Leonard Paradiso and Joan Webster. But if you notice one thing that's squared here in red, or, I mean, there's a rectangle around it rather than a square, that is the textbook. The textbook is going to come up in the investigation because they're going to say this is a Maya book that was submitted to the FBI for fingerprints. And the long story short is they're going to say that there's a book that was on the shelf that could have only come from Joan Webster. It was her textbook. But here's the description of the Maya book that was seized from Paradiso. It's a large and heavy coffee table book, and it was out of print in 1975, 6 years before Joan's flight. Joan disappeared in 1981. The book itself is a coffee table book. It measures 13 by 9 3/4, and also by 1 1/4 inches, and it weighs over 8 pounds. It is hardly the kind of reading material to take along on a flight to a weekend holiday, and it mainly consists of color photographs and a bit of text, presents an overview of Mayan history and culture for the general reader. Architectural content, by my count, is about 10% total. In any case, it was out of print years before Joan Webster boarded her flight. So the book was seen photographed on Leonard Paradiso's bookshelf, and this was seized on April 25th, 1983 during the Iannuzzi search warrant, and it's even included in the Paradiso files by Tim Burke. Now, a book can be out of print and still be purchased by somebody, but to say that it was Joan Webster's textbook is highly unlikely. I went to college, even grad school. I certainly never had a coffee table book used as a textbook. There is quite a difference. And the long story short is, I think that the more convincing piece of evidence, if you look at this slide, there are two things that are written in red: not Joan's book, not a textbook. Yes, of course, somebody can purchase an out-of-print book, but if it's not a textbook, game over. It's not a textbook, and I highly doubt that this Harvard architecture student, Joan Webster, would be using a coffee table book in one of her classes, but it appears that it wasn't hers either. Moving on to another piece of evidence here. This will be the safety deposit box, item seized. Special Agent Steve Brose conducted a search on Paradiso and Candy Wyant's joint safety deposit box on July 28, 1983. Box number 59 was located at the Haymarket Cooperative Bank. The FBI identified a red silk jewelry pouch Burke and Palumbo suggested belonged to Joan Webster. Joan's prints were not found on the jewelry pouch or any of the items seized from the box. And the next slide has a photo of the jewelry pouch. This is the one they were trying to say was Joan's, but Candy Wyant had loaned the pouch to Leonard Paradiso to sheath a prized shark's tooth. Candy Wyant retained the two remaining pieces of the box, and it was not Joan Webster's. Eve Carson has provided the alternative that this came from Candy Wyant. And if you heard the recent episode that we did on the murder of Marie Iannuzzi, Candy Wyant's role in this will be very critical because she is the person who's actually transporting Marie Iannuzzi to and from the bar on the night that she was murdered. I mean, to the bar and then going back to the house party to get Leonard Paradiso, and she's his ride. She's the one who is doing the driving. Now, the next item is a little bit difficult to see, and that is Joan Webster's gold charm bracelet, which says in red here that it was never recovered. Joan Webster was found with her jewelry on. I've repeated that one many times. Her clothes had been removed, and she had been placed into a trash bag, and her remains were found in 1990 in Chabaco Road near Hamilton, Massachusetts. It's really quite difficult to see here, but the authorities wanted to say that Leonard Paradiso had murdered Joan Webster, and that the bracelet had been taken off of Joan and then given to Leonard Paradiso's girlfriend, Candy Wyant. But Eve Carson has put forward the claim that these are not the same bracelets, and they're just two different bracelets. They're both gold, and they both have charms on them, but they are not the same. Joan Webster's gold bracelet was actually never recovered, even though she had some jewelry. I believe this one was never recovered. And there's a photograph of Charlene Bullerwell that was seized under the Iannuzzi search warrant on April 25th, 1983. And Tim Burke falsely accused that someone else is wearing the bracelet that is identical to Joan Webster's. And it's really quite difficult to see from the photos, but it appears that that simply was not Joan Webster's bracelet. Tim Burke and Andrew Palumbo falsely alleged that glass shards and liquor bottles found on the recovery of the boat were from the assault on Joan Webster and the murder of Joan later on, the subsequent murder, we should say. The Palumbo warrant for the splinter in Leonard Paradiso's finger was issued in January of 1985, and Burke's statement to the Boston Herald on January 17th of 1985, and Lynn's daily item on January 18th, 1985. On September 27th, 1983, the boat is raised, and there's a subsequent search, and among many items found in the cabin were several shards of broken glass. Well, I mean, even if there's glass on the boat, we know that they have the liquor bottles there. That isn't important. How do we know that one of those liquor bottles was used to strike Joan Webster in the head? So, I think that is really quite difficult to argue. Burke had been seeking a court to have to surgically remove what appears to be a metallic silver splinter that is embedded in Paradiso's left index finger. He said the silver may have come from the bottle. Glass shards were found aboard Paradiso's boat, but when the divers raised it from the harbor, Burke wanted to compare them. And then they said that the glass shards were found on Paradiso's boat, and Burke states the splinter could have only been evidence connecting Paradiso to Joan. Further corroboration, evidence that the pieces of broken glass were found on the cabin area. The object under his finger may be a piece of physical evidence in connecting him to the murder of Joan Webster. Now you might be noticing something, and that is that how does this prove that somebody murdered anybody? I mean, even if somebody has glass shards under their fingernails, well, I mean, if that is from a bottle on his boat, and even if it were true, okay, that just means that he was present on his own boat. How would that mean that somebody had murdered somebody with a whiskey bottle? Or the book? You might be also thinking about that. Why wouldn't anybody challenge them on that and say, hey, this book was out of print, this Mayan book is not a Harvard textbook, it is a coffee table book, and it most likely, or they could even go through and find out, was it actually issued by any of the professors to be on the reading list, or was Joan Webster even going to be using it for a class? Wouldn't any defense attorney simply tear this apart? And I asked that question directly to Eve Carson, and she responded by saying that, well, that's the whole point. Leonard Paradiso wasn't on trial for Joan Webster's murder. Gareth Penn even talked about this in part 1. Instead, he was tried for the murder of Maria Iannuzzi, and he was convicted for the murder of Maria Iannuzzi, and then they attributed Joan Webster's death to him. So the defense attorney didn't challenge them on these points because they weren't relevant to the Iannuzzi trial. They weren't discussed in the Iannuzzi trial. And I was like, I mean, no matter what, though, it's like, you would think somebody would have called them out on this type of very, very far out and wacky thinking. The only item submitted to the FBI lab by Tim Burke as glass was not identified where the item came from, so that's something else. And I wouldn't think that any type of physical evidence that had been lifted from the bottom of the Boston Harbor would be useful in this way. Once again, you'd think that somebody would be able to dismantle that, even if some way, somehow, you found some type of evidence that was on land versus something that was at the bottom of the harbor. You'd think that there would be a way to just say that, hey, these things are in two different places. Couldn't they have been achieved, and couldn't that have been achieved in some different way? Item Q38 was an item that Tim Burke submitted to the FBI lab on October 28th of 1983. Tim Burke called this glass with hair attached. Item Q38 was considered debris and unsuitable for testing. And in one of the red rectangles here, the one that is in the bottom right-hand side, on the bottom right-hand side, rather, that's what says unsuitable for testing. Right, like, I mean, I would expect that anything that had been submerged underwater for that long would be horribly, horribly contaminated, especially something like hair. I mean, we're talking about the early 1980s, not using any type of DNA technology that would have come out in the 1990s. Now let's talk about the source of that splinter, which they said would have come from something metallic, which I can only expect that they mean the cap of the liquor bottle. But on November 28th, 1981, Paradiso was at the Wyant home and tried to shine up a munition shell that he found on the beach. Paradiso used a grind wheel on the shell in Wyant's basement. Paradiso had 3 metal splinters embedded in his index finger. The finger was x-rayed on November 30th of 1981 and again on December 22nd of 1981. 2 splinters worked their way out. Tim Burke falsely claimed that Paradiso got the splinters on him when he was killing Joan with the whiskey bottle. And if they're metallic, they must mean like that rough edge around the cap of a whiskey bottle. Like if you're to unscrew it, then there's a metallic thing there. Some bottles also have additional metallic components. But Burke wanted to go after the splinter surgically, but the splinter did not show up on x-rays in February of 1985. Palumbo recovered the shell, and Paradiso was the source of the splinters on April 25th, 1983, a photo from Tim Burke's book. There were no glass shards or liquor bottles found on Paradiso's boat. As I said before, even if there were, so what, big deal. I mean, someone had liquor bottles on their boat, yes or no, it doesn't seem to be relevant. The splinter had no connection to Joan Webster. I mean, I'd follow Eve's narrative here. She's saying that it came from this 50 caliber munition shell, and it did not come from a whiskey bottle. I mean, even if he had a splinter from a whiskey bottle on his boat, that doesn't make him guilty. I mean, plus, I mean, they have that. You would have to establish that Joan Webster was actually struck on the head with that whiskey bottle, and I would feel that DNA evidence would be horribly compromised if any type of blunt force murder weapon was at the bottom of the Boston Harbor for 6 months, or was it more than that, a year and 6 months, excuse me. Andrew Palumbo and Tim Burke both filed false documents with the court seeking a search warrant to surgically remove the splinter. Palumbo's warrant supplement on January 1985. Burke briefed the court in January of 1985, and he later identified his informant as John O'Connell in his book. O'Connell worked at Pier 7 and defrauded the government of Housing and Urban Development grant money. O'Connell was in a penitentiary for perjury. This talks about the .357 Magnum. In short, this is getting back to the challenges we made to Gareth Penn's theory in Time 17 that Leonard Paradiso picked up Joan Webster from the airport, and then they took that late-night cruise together. No, the 357 was the gun that they had reported that Paradiso had used to get Joan onto the boat, that he had held her up at gunpoint more or less and said, all right, now you're going to get on the boat. But then he threw the 357 into the water, and I don't know why he would have done that if that wasn't the murder weapon. They're saying that it was the whiskey bottle the whole time, so this also is quite odd. Tim Burke seats witnesses. Burke seated Officer Nick Sagesi on March 7, 1984, during the Marie Iannuzzi pretrial hearing. The assigned divers with equipment were still searching the waters and still there. They did not find a gun. Assigned divers found nuts and bolts and fish bones underneath the mooring. Burke took his own diver to Pier 7 to search for the alleged gun. The gun was located under Paradiso's moored boat. Burke offered no evidence that the gun belonged to Paradiso or used to force Joan onto the boat. It was planted evidence. And from doing a previous episode on the murder of Joan Webster, I think I can understand Eve Carson's theory that it was that they put the gun there, that it was purely planted, actually dropped in the water by somebody connected to the prosecution. And, I just think that that's so bizarre. Firstly, why is he driving this illegal taxi when it's not really his occupation? Everything else they say about him is that he sold clams. And then the second thing is, okay, if he used the gun to get her onto the boat, there would be no evidence to connect that gun to the murder. If she were strangled and struck with a whiskey bottle, it would be purely impractical to throw the gun into the water. That makes no sense to me, but that is something that they said here. And the other thing I wanted to say is for finding the gun, that it was Tim Burke's diver who found it, not one that was done by an independent investigation. The O'Connell interview that was conducted by the federal marshals on August 1st and 8th of 1983 had the report submitted to Special Agent Steve Rose on August 12, 1983. O'Connell's divers found a Mercedes at Pier 7, not a gun. They found a Mercedes on the bottom. Talk about weird. And let's just read that there. Stated that the water between the barge Erie and the general ship is usually at least 30 or 40 feet deep. The water is very murky, and nothing would be seen. A diver down for tools, and the diver found a Mercedes on the bottom. Stated that the opinion Paradiso could have let his boat fill with water, cut it loose, and it would have easily sunk in front of the OSC facility. Okay? Burke's other evidence against Bond. Tim Burke submitted a sworn affidavit. I read Burke's other evidence, Robert Bond. Burke submitted a sworn affidavit to the court in January of 1985 for the surgical removal of a presumed splinter in Paradiso's finger. Burke states his other evidence is an alleged confession to Robert Bond. Remember, Bond is in jail, and he is the jailhouse informant. He is allegedly hearing all of these things from Paradiso. Robert Bond alleged that Paradiso murdered Joan on his boat, but that didn't happen because the boat was underwater at the time. In July of 81, the boat was already down there. Bond alleged that Paradiso dumped Joan's body in the Boston Harbor. False. She was buried off of Tobacco Road in Hamilton, Massachusetts. The authorities claimed that Bond's allegations were the break in the case. Bond was transferred to the Charles Street Jail on December 8th of 1982. Joan Webster certainly was not dumped in the Boston Harbor. That is safe to say. So Robert Bond is a false witness, and he is not the break in the case. The authorities are misrepresenting something, or something was not correct. Now you might be wondering, who actually murdered Joan Webster? And was it Michael O'Hare? Was it Gareth Penn? Or was it somebody who's connected to this group of individuals? And George Webster, Joan Webster's father, is even going to become a suspect in his own daughter's murder. Eve Carson has said that it is possible that he is the culprit. But that is quite different. I don't think I'm at the level yet in which I can accuse George Webster, simply because I don't know in as much about the subject as she does. But when you look at Gareth Penn's responses in Time 17, I think that it'd be one of the few times where I would agree with the FBI. Everything seems forced. It's like he is trying to use over-control to make his narrative work. He's trying to manipulate the readers into believing that there's this criminal masterpiece going on with mathematical signatures, and it's a Harvard graduate, MIT lecturer, when in reality, Joan Webster was abducted by somebody in Boston, Massachusetts, and she was driven to the northeastern area near Hamilton, Massachusetts, and then her body was dumped there. What happened in between that? That is purely a mystery. But perhaps one day we will get answers because of some new evidence in the case. Anyway, thank you for listening to this presentation here, as well as the first segment on the Zodiac Killer. So I would love to see your comments in the section below, and as always, you can like and subscribe. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com, and you can also follow on Instagram, BlackBoxNed88. See you there for the bonus podcast, and a big thank you to Eve Carson for the presentation. That's all from me now. Until next time.